What would you do if you were giving birth during a deadly blizzard with no doctor for 200 miles? Molly Whitmore gripped the rough wooden bed frame as another contraction tore through her body like lightning. Her knuckles white against the pine logs her husband Jacob had cut just 2 months ago when they still believed this baby would come in spring. Outside their one-room cabin, the Montana wind howled like a pack of starving wolves, driving snow through every crack and gap until frost painted the inside walls with delicate crystals that would have been beautiful if they weren't slowly killing her family. The fire in their stone hearth flickered dangerously low, and Molly knew with terrible certainty that Jacob wouldn't be coming home tonight. Maybe not ever, trapped somewhere in the mountains where he'd gone hunting for the elk meat they desperately needed to survive the winter. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Tokyo, midnight in London, afternoon in Texas, or evening in Sydney. I want to know where in the world you are as we dive into this incredible story of survival on the American frontier. 8-year-old Susie Whitmore sat huddled in the corner near the dying fire, her blue eyes wide with fear as she watched her mother's face contort with pain that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The child had seen animals give birth on their small homestead, watched their milk cow deliver calves, and their sow birth piglets, but nothing had prepared her for the terrifying sounds coming from her mother's throat or the way Molly's hands clawed at the threadbare quilt like she was trying to climb out of her own skin. "Mama," Susie whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Should I try to get to the Thompson place?" The question hung in the air like ice crystals, because they both knew the answer was death, that no 8-year-old could survive the 2-mile journey through chest-deep snow and winds that could freeze a person solid in minutes. The cabin that had seemed so cozy and secure just that morning now felt like a trap closing around them, its log walls creaking and groaning under the weight of snow that kept piling higher against the windows until only the faintest gray light filtered through. Molly tried to remember everything the old midwife in Independence had told her before they'd left Missouri, tried to recall the stories her own mother had shared about frontier births, but the pain was making it impossible to think clearly about anything except the terrifying certainty that something was going very wrong. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another month, and she could feel in her bones that this early arrival meant trouble, the kind of trouble that killed mothers and babies on the frontier, where help was measured in days of travel rather than minutes. Every few seconds, she found herself looking toward the door, praying to hear Jacob's boots on the porch, knowing he would take charge and somehow make everything right, but hearing only the endless shriek of wind that sounded like the cries of all the women who had died alone in cabins just like this one. As darkness fell and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Molly realized with crystal clarity that she and Susie were facing this crisis completely alone, cut off from the world by walls of snow and wind that might as well have been prison bars. The nearest neighbor was the Thompson family 2 miles south, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they could do tonight, and the closest doctor was in Fort Benton, a 6-day ride in good weather that was now impossible until spring came to melt the snow. Her labor pains were coming faster now, each one stealing her breath and filling her with the primitive fear that had haunted women since the beginning of time, the knowledge that childbirth was still one of the most dangerous things a woman could do, especially here on the frontier where death waited behind every decision and mistake. Susie crept closer to the bed, her small hand reaching out to touch her mother's arm, and Molly saw in her daughter's face the terrible understanding that tonight, this little girl might have to become a woman in ways that no child should ever have to face. The wind outside grew even stronger as midnight approached, rattling the cabin's single door and making the roof timbers groan like they were about to give way under the weight of snow that kept falling harder and faster with each passing hour. Molly's water broke with a rush that soaked through their only good blanket, and she knew there was no turning back now, no way to stop what was happening even if help miraculously appeared at their door. "Susie," she gasped between contractions, "you need to listen very carefully to Mama now. because I'm going to need you to be the bravest little girl in all of Montana Territory." The words came out broken and desperate, but Molly forced herself to speak calmly because she could see the terror in her daughter's eyes and knew that panic would kill them both faster than the storm ever could. As another wave of pain crashed over her, she realized that in the next few hours, everything would change forever, and she prayed to God that when morning came, there would still be someone left alive to see the sun rise over their frozen mountain home. Mary Crow Feather saw the smoke signals rising from Bear Creek Ridge just as the storm reached its full fury, three puffs of gray against the white sky that meant only one thing in this territory. Someone was dying and needed help desperately. The 60-year-old Blackfoot woman stood in the doorway of her small cabin, her weathered face reading the message that most white settlers would never understand, and she knew without a doubt that those signals came from the direction of the Whitmore place, where young Molly was heavy with child. The wind whipped her long gray braids across her face as she calculated the distance, the danger, and the slim chances of survival for anyone foolish enough to venture out in weather that had already claimed 3 lives this winter. Most people would have stayed safe by their fires and said prayers for whoever was in trouble, but Mary Crow Feather was not most people, and she had never let a woman die in childbirth if there was any way she could prevent it. Her own tragedy had made her the territory's most trusted midwife, though the story was one she rarely told and never without tears threatening to spill from her dark eyes. 23 years ago, she had lost her first daughter during a breech birth when no one knew how to turn the baby, had watched her beautiful girl struggle for 18 hours before both mother and child died in her arms, while Mary could do nothing but hold them and weep. The white doctor from Fort Benton had arrived 2 days too late, but he had seen something in Mary's desperate questions and careful attention that made him offer to teach her everything he knew about bringing babies safely into the world. For 3 years, she had studied with Dr. Morrison, learning to read his medical books despite having no formal education, memorizing every procedure and technique, while also preserving the ancient healing knowledge her grandmother had passed down through generations of Blackfoot women who had helped their sisters survive the dangers of childbirth. Now, as she pulled on her heaviest buffalo coat and wrapped her feet in layers of rabbit fur and oiled leather, Mary could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle passed down from every woman who had ever fought death for the right to bring new life into the world. Her medicine bag contained herbs that could stop bleeding, roots that could ease pain, and instruments she had fashioned herself from bone and metal, tools that had saved dozens of babies and mothers over the years since she had dedicated her life to this sacred work. She checked her supplies one more time, adding extra sage for purification and willow bark for fever, knowing that frontier births often brought complications that required every trick she had learned from both traditional medicine and modern techniques that Dr. Morrison had taught her before his own death 2 winters past. Her horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Thunder, snorted and stamped in the makeshift stable behind her cabin, clearly reluctant to leave the warmth and shelter for a journey that would test every ounce of strength and endurance they both possessed. Mary spoke to him in the Blackfoot language, her voice low and soothing as she explained what they had to do, why they couldn't stay safe while a woman and child faced death alone in the storm that was already being called the worst blizzard in living memory. Thunder had carried her through dangerous situations before, had navigated mountain passes and howling winds, and crossed frozen rivers where the ice groaned and cracked beneath their weight, and she trusted him to find a way through snow that was already drifting higher than a man's head in some places. As Mary swung into the saddle and urged Thunder out into the storm, she thought about all the women she had helped over the years, faces that appeared in her mind like photographs of courage and determination in the face of impossible odds. There was Elena Rodriguez, who had delivered twins during a Comanche raid while bullets flew over their adobe house, and Margaret O'Brien, who had given birth to her son while their wagon train waited out a tornado on the Kansas plains, and Sarah Fletcher, who had insisted on helping deliver her neighbor's baby just 3 days after delivering her own daughter in their sod house during a prairie fire. Each story reminded Mary why she couldn't stay safe in her cabin tonight, why she had to risk everything for the chance to save another mother and child. Because this was more than just her calling or her profession. It was her sacred duty to the sisterhood of women who understood that bringing life into the world was worth any price, including their own lives. Thunder's hooves found purchase in the deep snow as they began the treacherous journey toward Bear Creek Ridge, where smoke signals had carried a desperate plea for help across miles of frozen wilderness. And Mary Crow Feather rode into the teeth of the storm with the determination of a woman who had already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again on her watch. The sound of Thunder's hooves pounding through the snow reached the cabin just as Molly felt something tear inside her body, a sensation so terrifying and wrong that she screamed despite trying to stay quiet for Susie's sake. Mary Crow Feather burst through the door like an avenging angel, snow swirling around her buffalo coat and ice crystals sparkling in her gray braids, her dark eyes immediately taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen every possible complication that could arise during childbirth. Blood soaked the bed beneath Molly, far too much blood for a normal delivery, and the baby's heartbeat was growing weaker with each contraction, signs that told Mary this would be one of the most difficult births she had ever attempted. "Susie," she said calmly, stripping off her coat and rolling up her sleeves. "I need you to put more wood on that fire and boil every pot of water we can find. Then bring me all the clean cloth in this cabin, including your Sunday dress if that's what it takes." Molly's face was pale as winter moonlight, her lips tinged blue from shock and blood loss. But her eyes showed the fierce determination of a woman who would fight death itself to bring her child safely into the world. Mary knelt beside the bed and placed her weathered hands on Molly's swollen belly, feeling for the baby's position while silently praying to the Great Spirit and the Christian God both, because tonight she would need all the help she could get from any source willing to provide it. The baby was breech, feet first instead of head down, and the umbilical cord was wrapped around its neck like a noose. Complications that would challenge even the best doctors in the biggest cities, let alone an old woman working by lamplight in a cabin that was slowly being buried by snow. "Molly," Mary said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "This baby wants to come into the world dancing instead of diving, which means we're going to have to be very clever about how we help it get here." For the next 6 hours, Mary worked with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery in a battlefield hospital, her hands moving with the practiced precision that came from decades of bringing babies safely through the most dangerous moments of their lives. She used herbs from her medicine bag to slow Molly's bleeding, ancient remedies that her grandmother had taught her combined with techniques Dr. Morrison had shown her for turning breech babies, all while coaching Molly through contractions that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Susie became her assistant, holding oil lamps to provide light, bringing hot water and clean cloths, and even helping to support her mother's legs during the most difficult procedures. This 8-year-old girl showing courage that would have impressed seasoned soldiers. The cabin filled with the sounds of women's work, grunts of effort and whispered prayers, the splash of water and the rustle of fabric, while outside the storm continued to rage as if nature itself was holding its breath to see whether life or death would win this battle. When the baby's feet finally appeared, Mary knew they had reached the most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal, because breech deliveries could go from difficult to deadly in a matter of seconds if the shoulders got stuck or the head couldn't follow quickly enough. She worked with infinite patience and lightning speed, supporting the tiny body while gently maneuvering the shoulders through the birth canal, her fingers finding the umbilical cord and carefully unwrapping it from around the baby's neck before easing the head through in one smooth motion that took 20 years of experience to perfect. The baby emerged blue and silent, not breathing, and for a terrifying moment Mary thought they had lost the fight despite all their efforts. But then she turned the infant over and tapped its back with just the right amount of force, and suddenly the cabin filled with the most beautiful sound in the world, a newborn's first cry, angry and strong and full of life. Molly wept with relief and exhaustion as Mary placed the crying baby on her chest, a perfect little boy who had survived one of the most difficult births the old midwife had ever attended, his tiny fists waving in the air as if he was already ready to fight whatever challenges the frontier might throw at him. The bleeding had stopped, Molly's color was returning, and little Susie was laughing and crying at the same time as she touched her new brother's tiny fingers with wonder and awe. Mary cleaned up the evidence of their battle, washing her hands in the basin while silently thanking every spirit and saint who had guided her through this night, knowing that they had witnessed something miraculous in this small cabin buried in snow. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains and the storm finally began to weaken, Mary Crow Feather looked at the family she had helped save and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had once again cheated death of its prize, that another mother would live to raise her children, and another child would grow up to tell the story of the blizzard night when he almost didn't make it into the world. The frontier was full of dangers that could kill the strongest men, but tonight, in this cabin, life had won, and that victory would echo through generations of Whitmores who would carry the blood of survivors in their veins. The scream that shattered the peaceful morning air along the Platte River sent every person in the 200-wagon train running toward the overturned Conestoga that lay on its side, like a wounded animal beside the muddy crossing. Clara Henderson dropped the laundry she was washing and hiked up her skirts, her own 3-month pregnancy making her movements awkward as she rushed toward the disaster that had just claimed the Mills family wagon when the river current proved stronger than anyone had expected. Inside the wreckage, 22-year-old Rebecca Mills lay pinned beneath boxes of supplies and furniture, her face twisted with pain that had nothing to do with the cuts and bruises covering her arms, because the impact had triggered labor that wasn't supposed to start for another 6 weeks. "The baby's coming," Rebecca gasped, clutching her rounded belly as another contraction seized her. "It's too early. Something's wrong. Please help me." And Clara felt her heart sink as she realized they were facing a medical crisis that could kill both mother and child hundreds of miles from the nearest doctor. Wagon train Captain Samuel Morrison pushed through the crowd of settlers who had gathered around the accident, his weathered face grim as he assessed the situation that threatened to delay their entire journey during the narrow window of time when prairie travel was still possible before winter storms made the trails impassable. "We need to get her out of there and back on the trail," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led dozens of families across the dangerous route to Oregon. But Clara stepped forward with the quiet determination of a woman who understood that some things were more important than schedules and safety margins. "Captain, this woman is in premature labor, and if we try to move her now, we'll be digging 2 graves instead of 1, she said firmly, her own pregnancy giving her voice the weight of personal knowledge about what Rebecca was facing in this moment when every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The other women in the wagon train gathered around Rebecca like a protective circle, their faces showing the mixture of fear and determination that frontier women wore when facing the dangers that could claim any of them without warning. Martha Thompson, who had buried 2 babies on the trail from Missouri, knelt beside Rebecca and took her hand, whispering words of comfort while scanning the crowd for anyone who might have medical knowledge beyond basic first aid and prayer. "Does anyone know about delivering babies?" Martha called out, her voice carrying across the circle of worried faces, and Clara felt every eye turn toward her as the women remembered that she had helped her neighbor's wife through a difficult birth back in Independence, though that had been with an experienced midwife guiding every decision and a warm house instead of a muddy riverbank with hostile territory stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. Clara's hands shook as she knelt beside Rebecca, feeling completely inadequate for the task that circumstances had thrust upon her, because helping with one normal delivery in a comfortable bedroom was nothing like managing a premature birth in the middle of nowhere with only the supplies they could carry in their wagons. Rebecca's labor was progressing fast, too fast for a baby that wasn't ready to survive outside the womb, and Clara could see the signs that meant serious trouble. Bleeding that soaked through cloth faster than they could replace it, contractions that came so hard and close together that Rebecca couldn't catch her breath between them, and a baby that seemed determined to be born whether the world was ready or not. "We need privacy," Clara announced, and the women formed a human wall around Rebecca while the men were ordered to turn their backs and give them space to work, creating a sacred circle where the ancient drama of birth could play out according to its own rules rather than the demands of wagon train schedules. As Rebecca's labor intensified and the morning sun climbed higher over the endless prairie, Clara found herself drawing on every scrap of knowledge she had ever gained about childbirth, every story her mother had told about frontier births, every detail she could remember from watching the midwife back in Independence. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and Clara realized with crystal clarity that the next few hours would test everything she thought she knew about courage, determination, and the fierce instinct that drove women to protect each other in moments when death seemed more likely than survival. Rebecca gripped her hand with surprising strength for someone who had been injured in a wagon accident. Her eyes locked on Clara's face, as if drawing strength from the calm confidence that Clara was desperately trying to project despite feeling completely out of her depth. Around them, the wagon train waited in tense silence. 200 people whose lives had been put on hold by the arrival of one tiny person who refused to wait for convenient timing or proper medical facilities. And Clara Henderson prepared to either save 2 lives or watch helplessly as the frontier claimed another mother and child in its endless appetite for tragedy and loss. The moment Clara felt the baby's feet instead of its head, she knew they had moved from a difficult situation to a potentially deadly one, because breech births killed more mothers and babies on the frontier than any other complication, and she had never even seen one attempted, let alone tried to manage one herself with nothing but basic supplies and desperate hope. Rebecca's screams grew weaker as blood loss sapped her strength, and Clara could see the life draining from her face with each contraction that brought the baby closer to a world it wasn't ready to enter. 6 weeks too early and positioned wrong for survival even under the best circumstances. "Martha, I need you to hold her shoulders down," Clara commanded, her voice steadier than she felt as she tried to remember everything Dr. Patterson's medical book had said about breech presentations, the thick volume that her father had packed in their wagon against her mother's protest that it took up too much valuable space. The circle of women pressed closer as Clara worked, their faces grim with the understanding that they were witnessing one of the most dangerous moments any of them had ever seen, because everyone knew the stories of women who died when babies came the wrong way, tales whispered around campfires about mothers who bled to death or children who strangled on their own cords before drawing their first breath. Rebecca's husband Tom paced frantically outside their protective circle, his face pale with the helpless terror of a man watching his wife, an unborn child, slip away while he could do nothing but pray and wait for news that might destroy his world forever. Captain Morrison kept checking his pocket watch and scanning the horizon for signs of Indian war parties that had been reported in the area, because a stopped wagon train was a vulnerable wagon train, and every hour they delayed increased the danger for all 200 souls under his protection. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to guide the baby's shoulders through the birth canal, following instructions from a medical book she had read only once and praying that her memory was accurate enough to save 2 lives that hung in the balance of her inexperience. The baby's body was so small and fragile that she was terrified of using too much force, but Rebecca was weakening rapidly from blood loss, and Clara knew they were running out of time before shock and exhaustion claimed the mother regardless of whether the baby survived the birth or not. "The head is stuck," she whispered to Martha, her voice barely audible above Rebecca's labored breathing, and she saw her own fear reflected in the older woman's eyes as they both realized that Clara was facing the moment every frontier midwife dreaded, when all the knowledge and skill in the world might not be enough to cheat death of its prize. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made every person in the wagon train freeze with terror, because riders on the prairie usually meant trouble of the worst kind, and Captain Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he squinted at the dust cloud rising from the eastern horizon. "Pawnee War Party," someone shouted, and suddenly the medical crisis became secondary to the immediate threat of attack, because Indian raids on wagon trains were swift and deadly affairs that left few survivors to tell the tale, and a train stopped in the open with women occupied by childbirth was the kind of target that war parties dreamed of finding. "We have to move now," Morrison commanded, but Clara looked up from Rebecca's blood-soaked form and shook her head with the quiet authority of a woman who had accepted that some battles were more important than survival itself, because she would not abandon a dying mother and unborn child even if it meant facing arrows and war cries in the next few minutes. The Pawnee riders crested the ridge and paused, their war paint and weapons clearly visible even at a distance, while Clara made the most desperate decision of her life and reached inside Rebecca's body to manually turn the baby's head, a procedure she had read about but never seen performed, knowing that she might kill them both, but also knowing that doing nothing would certainly result in their deaths. Rebecca's eyes rolled back as the pain overwhelmed her weakened system, and Clara felt the baby's skull beneath her fingers as she tried to ease it through the birth canal, while Martha pressed cloth against the hemorrhaging that threatened to steal Rebecca's life before her child could take its first breath. The baby emerged blue and still, its tiny chest motionless as Clara cleared its airways and began the frantic resuscitation efforts that would either bring it back to life or confirm that they had lost the race against time and circumstance. While 200 yards away, Pawnee warriors sat on their horses and watched the drama unfold, as if even they understood that the miracle of birth deserved respect regardless of which people were bringing new life into the dangerous world of the American frontier. Sarah Blackwood was pinning her daughter's wedding dress for the final fitting when young Tommy Rodriguez burst through her cabin door without knocking, his face flushed from riding hard and his words tumbling over each other in desperate urgency that made Sarah's heart skip with the familiar dread that came whenever someone needed her skills in the middle of the night. "Mrs. Blackwood, you have to come quick," the boy gasped, clutching the doorframe as he tried to catch his breath. "Maria Santos is dying at the ranch. The baby won't come, and she's been laboring for 2 days straight. And Senor Santos says he'll pay you anything if you can save his wife and child." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she looked from Tommy's desperate face to her daughter Elizabeth, radiant in the white silk dress that had taken 6 months to sew by hand, because tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, the wedding that would unite Elizabeth with the banker's son in a ceremony the entire territory had been anticipating for months. Elizabeth's face went pale as she understood the terrible choice her mother was facing, because the Santos Ranch was 30 miles through Comanche territory that had seen 3 attacks in the past month, a journey that would take Sarah away for at least 3 days if she survived the trip at all, which meant missing the wedding that they had planned and saved for since Elizabeth was 15 years old. "Mama, you can't go," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking with the pain of a daughter who understood her mother's calling but couldn't bear the thought of walking down the aisle alone, of celebrating the most important moment of her life without the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at happiness and respectability in a world that offered few opportunities for women to build secure futures. Sarah's hands shook as she unpinned the wedding dress, each tiny pearl button representing hours of work and dreams that might die if she rode out into the darkness to save a woman she had never met. But Sarah Blackwood had delivered over 200 babies in her 25 years as the territory's most trusted midwife, and she had never lost a mother when there was still time to save her, a record that had earned her respect from ranchers and farmers across hundreds of square miles of dangerous frontier where medical help was measured in days rather than hours. "Elizabeth," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. There's a woman dying tonight who has the same right to hold her baby that I had to hold you. And I cannot live with myself if I choose a party over a life, even if that party is the most important day in your young life." She began packing her medical supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this choice dozens of times before, loading her saddlebags with herbs and instruments, while her heart broke at the sight of her daughter's wedding dress hanging on the wall like a ghost of the celebration that would happen without the most important guest. The ride through Comanche territory tested every skill Sarah had learned in 25 years of frontier living. As she guided her mare through moonlit canyons and across streams where war parties might be waiting in ambush, her rifle loaded and ready while she prayed to reach the Santos Ranch before Maria's strength gave out completely. The night air carried the scent of sage and danger, and twice she heard sounds that might have been coyotes or might have been signals between warriors planning an attack on the lone woman foolish enough to travel these trails after dark. Her thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth, standing in that white dress with tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother choose duty over the daughter who had already sacrificed so much of her childhood to Sarah's calling. All the times Elizabeth had waited alone while her mother delivered other women's babies. All the birthdays and celebrations that had been interrupted by desperate pleas for help from families facing medical emergencies. As dawn broke over the Texas Hill Country and the Santos Ranch finally came into view, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of dread and determination that always preceded her most difficult cases, because Tommy Rodriguez's frantic ride meant that Maria was facing complications beyond anything a normal delivery should involve. The kind of crisis that separated skilled midwives from women who merely knew the basics of bringing babies into the world. The ranch house sat in a valley surrounded by low hills that could hide 100 Comanche warriors, and Sarah realized that she had not only risked missing her daughter's wedding, but had also ridden into what might be a trap, because isolated ranches were favorite targets for raids. And a Mexican family this far from civilization was living on borrowed time and territory that belonged to no government and recognized no law except the brutal justice of survival. She dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, because whatever dangers waited inside that house or in the hills around the ranch, there was a woman in labor who needed her skills, and Sarah Blackwood had never failed to answer such a call, even when the price might be her own life and her daughter's happiness. The arrow that whistled past Sarah's ear and buried itself in the wooden door frame told her everything she needed to know about why the Santos Ranch had been so quiet when she rode up. Because the Comanche war party had already surrounded the compound and turned what should have been a simple medical emergency into a fight for survival that would test every skill she possessed as both a midwife and a frontier woman. Inside the adobe house, she found Maria Santos writhing on a blood-soaked bed while her husband Carlos and his 3 vaqueros crouched beneath windows, returning sporadic rifle fire at warriors who had been circling the ranch since before dawn, waiting for the perfect moment to attack when the defenders were exhausted and low on ammunition. "Senora Blackwood," Carlos gasped, his face streaked with sweat and gunpowder. "Thank God you made it. But I fear you have ridden into hell itself, because these devils mean to kill us all and burn everything we have built here." Maria's labor had been going on for 36 hours according to her husband, and Sarah could see immediately that the baby was positioned wrong and too large for Maria's small frame, a combination that would have challenged even the best doctors in San Antonio under ideal conditions, let alone in a ranch house under siege where every sound might mask the approach of warriors seeking to break through their defenses. The contractions were coming hard and fast, but the baby wasn't descending, which meant Sarah would have to perform procedures that required absolute concentration while arrows thudded into the walls around them and rifle shots echoed through the rooms like thunder in a mountain storm. "Carlos, I need you to move your wife to the root cellar," Sarah commanded, already unpacking her medical supplies while calculating how much time they had before the Comanche grew tired of the siege and launched a direct assault that would overwhelm the small group of defenders. The journey to the root cellar became a terrifying race against time as Sarah and Carlos carried Maria through rooms where broken glass and splintered wood marked the places where arrows had found their way through shuttered windows. While outside, the war cries grew louder and more frequent, indicating that the warriors were working themselves up for the final attack that would determine whether anyone survived to see another sunrise. The underground chamber was cramped and dark, lit only by candles that cast dancing shadows on stone walls that had been built to store vegetables, but now served as a delivery room where life and death would battle for supremacy, while above them men fought a different kind of war for the same ultimate prize. Maria's face was gray with exhaustion and blood loss, her hands clutching Sarah's with a strength born of desperation as another contraction seized her body and forced a scream from her lips that was lost in the sound of gunfire and war whoops that grew closer with each passing minute. Sarah worked by candlelight with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery in a battlefield hospital, her hands moving with practiced precision as she tried to turn the baby into a position that would allow for a safe delivery, while rifle shots rang out overhead and dust filtered down from the ceiling with each impact of arrows against the wooden beams. The baby was large and stubborn, wedged in the birth canal at an angle that threatened to tear Maria apart from the inside. And Sarah found herself using techniques that pushed the boundaries of what frontier medicine could accomplish, manipulating the infant's position with a skill that came from 25 years of fighting death for the right to bring new life into the world. Carlos appeared at the top of the cellar stairs with his rifle in his hands and his face grim with the knowledge that their ammunition was running low, that the next assault might be the one that breached their defenses and brought the war party into the house, where they would find two women engaged in the ancient struggle that had nothing to do with territorial disputes or racial hatred. As Maria's labor reached its crisis point, and the sound of splintering would announce that the Comanche had broken through the front door, Sarah felt the baby's head finally crown and knew that they had reached the moment when everything would be decided in the next few minutes. Because either she would deliver this child successfully and get them all to safety, or they would die together in this underground chamber that had become both delivery room and tomb. The war cries echoed through the house above them as Sarah guided the baby's shoulders through the birth canal with infinite care, knowing that one wrong move could kill both mother and child even as the sounds of battle grew closer and more desperate. While Maria pushed with the last of her strength, and Sarah pulled with all the skill she had learned in a lifetime of bringing babies safely into a world that seemed determined to kill them before they could draw their first breath. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid just as the first Comanche warrior appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, his painted face and raised tomahawk illuminated by candlelight that revealed the moment when new life entered the world even as death stalked them all through the rooms above. And Sarah Blackwood held a crying infant while staring up at a warrior who had come to kill, but found himself witnessing the miracle that transcends all human conflicts and reminds even the fiercest fighters that some things are sacred regardless of which people bring them into being. Emma Turner was grinding corn for supper when Catherine Rogers' screams shattered the quiet evening air of Gold Creek mining camp, and the 16-year-old orphan felt her stomach drop with the terrible knowledge that she was about to become the only person standing between a woman and death, because the camp's doctor had ridden to Denver 3 days ago and wouldn't return for a week. Catherine's husband Jim burst from their one-room shack with wild eyes and hands that shook as he grabbed Emma's shoulders, his voice cracking with desperation as he begged the girl who had been caring for herself since she was 12 to somehow save his wife and the baby that was coming 2 months early in a place where medical emergencies usually meant digging graves. "Emma, you helped your ma deliver Mrs. Patterson's baby back in Missouri. You're the only one here who knows anything about birthing, and Catherine's been laboring since dawn with something going terribly wrong," he pleaded, and Emma felt the weight of 2 lives settling on her shoulders like a millstone that threatened to crush her beneath responsibilities no teenager should ever have to bear. The mining camp of Gold Creek existed in a narrow canyon where 50 men had come to scratch fortunes from the earth, but only 3 women lived among them. And Catherine Rogers was the closest thing to a mother figure that Emma had known since her own parents died of cholera during the journey west 2 years ago. Catherine had taught her to cook for miners, had shared her meager supplies when Emma's food ran low, and had held her when nightmares about her parents' deaths made sleep impossible. So there was no question that Emma would try to help, even though her experience with childbirth consisted of watching her mother assist with one normal delivery under the guidance of an experienced midwife who had talked them through every step. Mrs. Patterson's baby came easy, Emma whispered to herself as she gathered what medical supplies the camp possessed: a pitiful collection of whiskey for disinfectant, clean rags torn from the miners' spare shirts, and a sharp knife that would have to serve as a surgical instrument if the worst happened, and she had to make decisions that could save or kill both mother and child. Inside the Rogers shack, Emma found Catherine in the grip of labor that had already lasted 10 hours without producing any sign that the baby was ready to be born, and the experienced eye she had inherited from her mother immediately recognized the signs of serious trouble that went far beyond anything she had ever seen or heard described. Catherine's face was gray with exhaustion and blood loss, her contractions coming so hard and fast that she couldn't catch her breath between them, and Emma could feel through Catherine's swollen belly that the baby was positioned wrong, turned sideways instead of head down, a complication that killed mothers and babies even when experienced doctors were available to attempt the dangerous procedures required to save them. "Emma," Catherine gasped, gripping the girl's hand with surprising strength. "I can feel something's wrong. The baby's not coming right, and I need you to do whatever you have to do to save this child, even if it costs me my life." The weight of that request hit Emma like a physical blow, because Catherine was asking a 16-year-old girl to make life and death decisions that would challenge the most experienced physicians, to choose between saving the mother or the baby if it came down to an impossible choice that frontier women faced every day without the luxury of hospitals or trained doctors to guide them through the crisis. Emma's hands trembled as she examined Catherine and confirmed her worst fears about the baby's position, because she could feel a tiny shoulder pressed against the cervix where a head should be. And she knew from her mother's stories that babies who tried to be born sideways usually died along with their mothers unless someone was skilled enough and brave enough to attempt the manual manipulation that could either save them both or kill them in the process. The shack filled with the sound of Catherine's labored breathing and the distant noise of miners returning from their claims. Men who had no idea that the most important drama in Gold Creek's short history was playing out in the one-room cabin where a teenage girl was preparing to either perform a miracle or witness a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As darkness fell over the canyon and Catherine's strength continued to ebb with each failed contraction, Emma realized that she had reached the moment every frontier woman dreaded, when all the book learning and secondhand knowledge in the world meant nothing compared to the terrible necessity of acting despite insufficient experience. Because doing something was the only alternative to watching helplessly while 2 people died who might be saved by courage and desperation and the kind of luck that God sometimes granted to those who were willing to risk everything for others. "Catherine," Emma said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, "I'm going to try to turn this baby, and it's going to hurt worse than anything you've felt so far, but it's the only chance we have to get you both through this alive." Catherine nodded through tears of pain and fear, and Emma Turner placed her small hands on the swollen belly of the woman who had become her surrogate mother, preparing to attempt a procedure that would either mark her as a hero or a killer in a mining camp where news traveled fast and judgments lasted forever. While outside the shack, 50 men went about their evening routines with no idea that the girl they barely noticed was about to become the instrument of salvation or destruction for the family that had given Gold Creek its only taste of domestic happiness in a world of mud and greed and broken dreams. Emma's hands disappeared inside Catherine's body as she attempted the most dangerous procedure in frontier medicine, trying to manually turn a baby that was determined to be born sideways in a position that would kill them both if she couldn't coax it into the right alignment for delivery. Catherine's screams filled the small shack and echoed off the canyon walls, bringing miners running from their claims and their evening meals to gather outside the Rogers cabin where they stood in helpless silence. 50 hard men who could blast through solid rock, but were powerless to help in this battle between life and death that was being fought by a 16-year-old girl with nothing but courage and desperate determination. Emma felt the baby's tiny body beneath her fingers, slippery with blood and amniotic fluid, and she closed her eyes while trying to remember every detail her mother had shared about difficult births. Every story she had heard about babies who refused to come the normal way and the brave women who had saved them through procedures that pushed the boundaries of what human hands could accomplish. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck like a noose, cutting off oxygen with each contraction that squeezed the life from the tiny body, while Emma worked with infinite patience and lightning speed to free the cord and turn the baby's head toward the birth canal. Catherine's pulse was growing weaker by the minute as blood loss sapped her strength, and Emma could see death creeping into her friend's face, the gray pallor and sunken eyes that marked women who were slipping away despite all efforts to save them. But she refused to give up even when her own hands cramped from the delicate work and sweat dripped into her eyes until she could barely see what she was doing. "Come on, little one," she whispered to the baby she couldn't see but could feel fighting for life beneath her touch. "Your mom is waiting to meet you, and this whole camp is praying for you to make it into the world where you can grow up strong and stubborn like the rest of us." Outside the cabin, Jim Rogers paced back and forth like a caged animal while the miners formed a protective circle around the shack, their faces grim with the understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and terrible, the ancient struggle that had claimed so many frontier women who dared to bring new life into a world that seemed designed to snuff it out before it could take root and flourish. Big Mike Sullivan, the camp's unofficial leader, pulled out his pocket watch and announced that Catherine had been in labor for 18 hours, a length of time that usually meant death for both mother and child. But nobody suggested giving up because they had all come to love the young woman who had brought domesticity and gentleness to their rough camp where violence and loneliness were the usual companions. "That girl's got steel in her backbone," whispered old Pete Morrison, who had seen Emma survive the death of her parents and carve out a life for herself in a place where most grown men struggled to stay alive. "And if anyone can pull off a miracle tonight, it's Emma Turner." The moment when everything changed came so suddenly that Emma almost missed it, a subtle shift in the baby's position that told her the head was finally aligned with the birth canal. But the umbilical cord was still wrapped tight around the tiny neck, and she had perhaps 30 seconds to deliver the baby before brain damage or death claimed another frontier child who almost made it into the world. Her fingers worked with the precision of a surgeon as she guided the baby's head through the cervix while simultaneously loosening the cord, a procedure that required her to essentially perform 2 operations at once, while Catherine pushed with the last of her strength and the entire mining camp held its collective breath. The baby's head crowned just as Catherine's eyes rolled back and her body went limp, and Emma realized with horror that she might save the child only to lose the mother. But she couldn't stop now, couldn't let Catherine's sacrifice be wasted when they were so close to victory. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid, blue and motionless, its tiny chest still and silent while Emma cleared its airways and began the frantic resuscitation efforts that would either bring it back to life or confirm that all their struggle had been in vain. She breathed into the infant's lungs while massaging its chest, techniques her mother had taught her for reviving newborns who didn't start breathing on their own, all while keeping one eye on Catherine, whose breathing was so shallow it was barely visible and whose pulse fluttered like a dying bird beneath Emma's fingers. The seconds stretched into eternity as Emma worked over both mother and child, refusing to accept that death might claim them after everything they had endured. And then suddenly the baby's chest expanded with its first independent breath, and a cry filled the cabin, weak but unmistakably alive, while Catherine's eyes fluttered open and she whispered her child's name with a voice that carried more love than the Colorado mountains contained gold. The cheer that erupted from 50 miners' throats echoed through Gold Creek Canyon like thunder, announcing to the world that another frontier family had survived the ultimate test. And Emma Turner wiped tears from her face as she placed the crying baby on Catherine's chest, knowing that she had just experienced the most important moment of her young life. The moment when she truly became a woman capable of fighting death itself and winning. The Christmas celebration at Mary Crowfeather's cabin brought together women whose stories had become legend across the Montana Territory. And as snowflakes danced outside the frosted windows, for generations of frontier strength gathered around a table that groaned under the weight of food prepared by hands that had pulled life from the jaws of death more times than anyone could count. Molly Whitmore sat with her robust toddler son Jacob on her lap. The boy who had been born during the worst blizzard in living memory, now babbling happily while reaching for the carved wooden horse that his father had made to commemorate the night when everything almost ended before it began. Beside her, Clara Henderson bounced her own healthy daughter on her knee. Little Sarah, who had been born safely on the Oregon Trail 3 months after Clara had saved Rebecca Mills and her premature son during the Pawnee standoff that had tested every woman's courage in ways they never could have imagined when they started the journey west. Rebecca Mills herself had made the long journey from Oregon Territory with her son Michael, now a strong 18-month-old who bore no trace of the trauma that had marked his dramatic entrance into the world on a muddy riverbank, while warriors watched from the hills, and his mother bled her life away until Clara's inexperienced hands had somehow coaxed him safely from the womb. The boy played with wooden blocks on the cabin floor, his laughter mixing with the sound of women's voices as they shared stories that would be passed down through generations of frontier families, tales of courage and determination that proved what the human spirit could accomplish when survival depended on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sarah Blackwood had arrived from Texas with her daughter Elizabeth, now a radiant young bride whose wedding had been postponed but not canceled. Because the man who truly loved her understood that he was marrying into a family where duty to others sometimes required personal sacrifice. Maria Santos sat quietly in the corner, nursing her baby daughter while her husband Carlos stood guard outside. Because even Christmas celebrations in Comanche territory required vigilance. But inside the warm cabin there was peace and the kind of joy that comes from knowing that life had triumphed over impossible odds. Her child had been born during a siege that should have killed them all, delivered in a root cellar while arrows flew overhead and warriors sought to burn everything her family had built. But the baby had arrived healthy and strong despite the trauma that had surrounded her birth. Emma Turner, no longer the frightened 16-year-old who had saved Catherine Rogers and her son in Gold Creek mining camp, now served as the unofficial midwife for 3 counties, her reputation for skill and courage drawing desperate families from hundreds of miles away when other options had been exhausted, and only a miracle could save mother and child from the dangers that still claimed too many frontier women. Catherine Rogers had traveled from Colorado with her son Thomas, the boy whose sideways birth had nearly killed them both, but who now ran around the cabin with the boundless energy of a healthy 2-year-old, his existence proof that sometimes teenage girls with more heart than experience could perform medical miracles that would challenge trained physicians in the biggest cities. The women shared their stories with younger wives who had recently arrived on the frontier, passing down knowledge that couldn't be found in medical books, techniques, and wisdom born from necessity and refined through trial and error in situations where failure meant death and success meant families could continue the hard work of building civilization in a wilderness that tested every dream and broke many spirits. They spoke of herbs that could stop bleeding, positions that could ease difficult deliveries, and most importantly, The mental strength required to remain calm and focused when terror and desperation threatened to overwhelm judgment and skill. As the evening drew to a close and the women prepared to return to their scattered homes across the vast territory, Mary Crow Feather stood and raised her cup of coffee in a toast that honored not just the mothers and babies who had survived, but all the women who had fought the same battles and lost. The countless frontier wives and daughters whose graves dotted the landscape, like markers of humanity's determination to populate the wilderness regardless of the cost in tears and blood. To the women who came before us, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 6 decades spent bringing life into a world that seemed designed to extinguish it. And to the women who will come after us, may they inherit a safer world, but never forget the price that was paid to give them that gift. The statistics were sobering even in their moment of celebration, because frontier women still died in childbirth at rates that would horrify modern people. 1 in 10 mothers lost to complications that could be easily treated in hospitals with trained doctors and proper equipment. But in this cabin on Christmas night 1825, surrounded by children whose very existence proved that love and courage could overcome impossible odds, the women who had gathered to share their stories represented something more precious than statistics or medical advances. They embodied the spirit that had built America one birth at a time, one family at a time, one act of heroism at a time, when ordinary people chose to risk everything for the chance to bring new life safely into the world. Their legacy lived on in the children who played at their feet, in the techniques they taught to younger women, and in the unbreakable bonds forged between mothers who had faced death together and emerged victorious through skill, determination, and the kind of luck that seemed to favor those brave enough to bet their lives on the future. As Mary Crow Feather banked the fire and prepared for sleep, she whispered a prayer for all the women who would face similar challenges in the years to come, asking the Great Spirit to grant them the same strength, wisdom, and miraculous grace that had saved so many lives in the cabins and wagons and mining camps where American families had taken root in soil watered by the tears and blood of mothers who refused to let the frontier claim their children without a fight. If this incredible story of frontier courage moved your heart, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales of the brave women and men who built America against impossible odds. Because their stories of survival, sacrifice, and love deserve to be remembered and shared with every generation that follows in their footsteps.